There's a lot of people looking at their ancestry at the moment, isn't there? I've noticed this for the last, I suppose, 10, maybe 15 years, a lot of interest. I think the internet has enabled people to look up who the parents of their parents were, or their great-grandparents, and their various different lines or lineage. And it's been fascinating, and a lot of people in the course of me doing things like my Vobes show, or even the Bald Explorer, where I've been to places, and people say, "Oh yes, I know. I'm related in my lineage to this peer of the realm, or this minor royalty, or even there were labourers in my family who worked on the land in this particular area." And that's always, it's always fascinating, I suppose. And of course, we're all going to be related to somebody, and we're all related in many different ways, unsuspecting. And possibly, yes, we have lineage that stems down from some of the great and the good, who have these big country houses like Longleat and what have you. And it always makes me laugh when someone says they're related to them, and you think, well, maybe you've got a claim to that house. So there's a lot of interest in that. But I think that there is beginning to be, at least on my radar, as it were, an interest of people in the, not relations, but related to them in as much as the places that they live. So only the other day I noticed that one of my viewers lived in a house that had been lived in by somebody famous. And of course we don't all live in houses that are by somebody famous, but there are people who lived in the properties before us, unless of course it's a new build. And I'm indebted to Lee Lawson, who's an avid viewer of the show and a researcher into history and things of that ilk, and a friend who did a little bit of research on my house and found some fascinating characters who lived in here well before I occupied the place. This is my front door. I believe that the previous owner of my house, and I think it was at my front door, but it might have been at the back door, and you'll see why in a minute, collapsed and sadly died at the door of his house. And in today's episode, I want to go and find his grave. I've lived in this house, this Victorian terraced house in Worthing in West Sussex, for about 30 years, coming up to 31 years. It's the only house I've ever bought. I love it. I would be reluctant to sell it. I may sell it in the future at some point. Two of my children were born here. One was born, my daughter Georgie was born downstairs, and my son Billy was born upstairs in the 1990s. And my eldest son was born in St. Richard's Hospital in Chichester. So I have a huge affinity with this house. It's very important to me, but I've never bought another house. It's the only house I bought. And prior to that, I've rented and done bed sits and lodged and all of those sort of things, and had a flat with my then wife Dawn, who we moved and lived here. So it's fascinating to explore the history of previous occupants of the house and what they might have done. So it's not a terribly old house. It dates back to about 1870. This bit of land that it's on was owned by two women called Harriet and Emily Newland. Now I've got this report here that's been put together by Lee Lawson, all typed out, all about my house and possible occupants, depending on whether the numbers of the house in the terrace were changed when they built the houses opposite, because my row of houses are older than the houses opposite. We know that because there's a pub on the end, there's a number of houses, then there's another pub, and there's houses that were shops. People lived in different houses carrying out professions from their house back in the old days. Not everybody would have premises when they did their business. They would have just done them from the front room of their houses. Very much like people are doing again, thanks to you know what. There, a number of different people have lived here over the years, of course, and I don't have the details of everyone who's lived here. I don't, for example, know really from, I think, the 1940s, or yes, from about 1940 onwards to the present day. I don't know who lived in this house. All I can tell you is that when I moved in, it was a house that was owned by somebody and rented to other people. The information that Lee has mostly relied on is, of course, the census, and she says in this information that the census doesn't tell you who owns the house, it just tells you who was there on the day that the census was filled out. So you are sometimes having to speculate a little bit about certain people's relationships, unless of course you can then go and find birth certificates, marriage certificates and so on, death certificates as well, which Lee, being a researcher and thorough researcher, has already done. Now, I don't want to talk about any of the others because although they're interesting, this particular one is more interesting, I think, and poignant, I suppose, because the gentleman by the name of Stephen Blunden went out one evening. He was 57, I think, and he was smoking his pipe on his doorstep. Well, I think it must have been the front door, but there's no reason to suppose it couldn't have been the back door, except that help came fairly quickly for him, and I assume that probably if he was out the front, people would have noticed more than out the back. It depends if he was on his own or not. But he collapsed on the doorstep, and although help came, he did die. So I have been with Lee to have a look to find his grave, and we're going to go and do that in the latter part of this video. But I just wanted today to do something slightly different in my living alone video, and just tell you a little bit about this character, Stephen and Mary Blunden, who lived here. So this is 1889 in the census, 1891 I think it was, but Stephen Blunden, this is what Lee has found out. Stephen Blunden was born in Goring in 1833, where his father was a farm bailiff. He worked as a carpenter, a joiner and a furniture dealer. He married Mary Stevens in 1854 and had 9 daughters. 9. I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? Not a single son, 9 daughters, one after the other. Adeline, Agnes, Alice, Kate, Edith, Margaret, Mary, Minnie and Florence. Beautiful names. Beautiful names. Stephen and his family lived in various locations: Chapel Street, Field Row, Ambrose Place in Worthing, and by 1881 Stephen had changed career and become a market gardener. There was a lot of market gardening going on in Worthing, I guess because of the sun and the soil. Must have made it very handy, and of course we had the railways, which was able to transport the produce very easily. They moved out of the town, where they lived in a damp cottage in Pond Lane, and then eventually they moved. That's probably the last place she says, that till they moved into my house here in Worthing, which is at the edge of the town. And then an item in the Worthing Gazette on the 27th of November 1889 reports of the sudden death of Mr. Stephen Blunden. Apparently in good health, he stood at his doorway smoking his pipe when he was suddenly seized with illness, and although medical aid was obtained, he died within 2 hours. It was thought to be a heart attack. So that's interesting. Mary, his widow, lived at the house with 2 of her daughters, Margaret and Florence, who both married a few years later. Another daughter, Mary, was living with her mother, and the income from the properties owned by Stephen was evidently held in trust, as the woman had a private income. Mary Blunden died in 1901. So that's the sort of basis. The other bits and bobs about these characters who lived here. It's quite interesting to know that somebody died on the doorstep, because people died in their houses all the time, and of course still do. One wonders in this house whether he was laid out in state, either in the front room that I'm sitting in now, or possibly in the dining room, or whether he was taken to a funeral house or something like that. He was, we think, pretty well known in the town, not as a big, what would you call it, a VIP or anything, but he was probably known because he had his market gardens and what have you. So a fascinating thing, and very, very sad. This is a 2 up, 2 down house, but where my loo is possibly where an extra bedroom was, because other tenants or other owners had tenants or lodgers in here. But I don't want to linger in the house any longer, because I want to go and see if we can find certainly Stephen's, and then later Mary's grave. This is the Worthing and Broadwater Cemetery. It's about a mile north, really more in Broadwater than Worthing, from my house, and it's huge. It's absolutely massive, and has been a central place for people to be buried from, well, I'm not really sure, early Victorian times, probably up until the 1930s, something like that. I may have got that slightly wrong. It's absolutely overgrown at the moment. The grass, as you can see, and the plants and the wildflowers are everywhere. It is a nature haven, as well as a beautiful and restful place to come, especially on a hot, still day like today, just to be at one with nature. And the fact that you're surrounded by tombstones of people who have come or have been placed here to rest, I guess, is also very lovely. You can hear the roads, of course, and it is just off the A24, which is the main drag out of Worthing. I noticed that all the gates are shut for some reason. I'm not quite sure, except for a little entrance which I was able to get into because there's some workers there. But it's a wonderful place. Now I'm going to try and find the tombstone. I've been here before to find them with Lee, but it wasn't quite as overgrown as it is now. But I do think it's just up here and on the left. Fingers crossed, I'll find it. This is, well, that's Mary Blunden, and this is Stephen Blunden underneath here, in front of whatever this bush is in front of me, which has grown from him. Market gardener Stephen Blunden, who collapsed and died in 1898 on the 25th of November. I should remember these dates. On my doorstep. it's quite something to find the grave of somebody who died in your house and have that strange connection. A lot of the people who lived in my house were born and raised in Worthing, which is quite nice to know. They weren't, as you would probably find these days, a lot of people who die in houses now probably travelled from all parts of the globe, not least the UK. And so it's quite nice to think that this is somebody who was a Worthing man through and through. And that's Mary, who died a little later. When I came here with Lee and we were looking, it was very hard. There are plots, numbers and references, so it should make it easier to look them up. But we found it quite tricky actually, because a lot of the rows aren't really very level, and unless you're used to doing this, it's not so easy to locate. But I found it, and it was just, I suppose, quite apt that it was me that found them. They were covered in ivy, absolutely, and I pulled the ivy off. You can't really see it now, but they were just absolutely smothered in it. And I just had that inkling, you know, that sort of gut feeling, but I'd actually looked along a couple of others, and now it's nice to see them a bit more preserved. It would be great if that tree was pruned down a bit, not got rid of, but just pruned down a little so the access was a little easier to see from the front. But hey, there they are. Well, that was a bit unusual, wasn't it? A bit different. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to follow, like, subscribe, become a patron, support what I do, give me a thumbs up, all the usual stuff, and I will see you on another video. Till next time, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.